Good morning, good afternoon. We will give 15, 20 seconds for people to arrive in to the meeting before we get started.
Sounds good.
Okay, welcome to Unscripted, Conversations about the Future of Research. This is the fourth episode of this week-long series. My name is Brian Nosek. I am a psychologist. I'm a professor at the University of Virginia, and I'm executive director of the organization called the Center for Open Science, which seeks to increase openness, integrity, and reproducibility of research. I had a great conversation yesterday with Mary Bassett, driving as the host, and I was so accelerated here that I got promoted to host for today. So I'm just having a great time with this, and really excited to have a conversation with Keolu Fox. Keolu is assistant professor at the University of California at San Diego. He's principal investigator of the Indigenous Futures Institute, and he's an adjunct investigator at the J. Craig Venter Institute. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today for this conversation. A few house notes before we get started. First is that we are streaming on LinkedIn and YouTube. So wherever you are, thanks for joining. It's also being recorded. So if you, who hasn't seen this right now, watch this after the fact, you'll know that you were able to watch it because it was recorded. And here you are. This is sponsored and organized completely by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We're very grateful to them for giving us this opportunity to have these interesting and unscripted conversations. And it fits right in the RWJF mission to sort of look for ways to improve how our society produces, collects, shares, and uses knowledge about health. The conversations that have come before this one have been super interesting and wide variety of topics. And I hope that we can sort of continue some of the themes that have come up, especially as we start to think about innovation and the use of research and how it is that people are involved in the research process, both in providing data, using that data, making use of that information as we go. So while Keolu and I are in conversation, we invite you to likewise be in conversation in the chat. You can share your reactions to things that come up in discussion or generate your own ideas and discuss amongst yourselves. To get that started, I will provide a prompt for you to respond to in chat, which is, what is a hope that you have for the future of research? So provide a response to that and see how others are reacting in the same way. Also, please keep in mind the community guidelines. RWJF is a private foundation, and so the federal laws restrict their activities against not having discussions about election campaigns or candidates or political party platforms. This is 40 minutes of your day to not think about those things and instead focus on the topics that we're going to discuss today. Okay, so that gives you some general stage setting for this. And the last thing to remind you of is that a unique part of the Unscripted series is this idea that we can put things on a shirt. We want to provoke conversations that extend beyond this series. So if you hear something or you have an idea, you can call out in the comments what that comment was and to put it on a shirt. And our WJF will create one cool shirt from each day's series and make that available for people to buy. In fact, the first 200 don't have to buy it at all. It's free, and help to foster that discussion and narrative beyond the series. That's it. So excited to jump right in. Keolu, I want to start our conversation by recalling something that Mary and I talked about yesterday. And that was part of the discussion arrived at taking risks in research. and recognizing that in order to really tackle big questions, you kind of have to be ready and willing to fail because it requires big and often audacious and often not so likely solutions. So I wonder, in that context, I had just seen the other day your TED Talk, and it fits the bill. It is audacious and bold and broad. And so I wonder if you could give some context of the idea that you presented in the TED Talk, and sort of a reflection on, how you think about risk in the ideas you pursue, how you develop ideas, what you worry about in terms of your ideas failing or succeeding. Any other reflections there would be delightful.
Yeah, that is a lovely question. And as the millennials say, let's unpack that. I think I think that anything worth pursuing is obviously going to have some risk that you need to think about and take into consideration. And oftentimes, I think that the best ideas that we pursue, you don't even realize that it's risky until you look behind you. But I'm a genome scientist, so most of my work kind of up to this point has focused on genomic tools, whether that's genome sequencing, and that is sort of mapping and reading the genome using various biomolecular techniques, and then editing, which would be writing. So reading the genome and then writing or making adjustments or finding those typos, changing them. And this has led to a bunch of different trajectories, one of which is like understanding our shared history, our diaspora, and our migratory history. And then how does that contribute to our susceptibility to develop disease, like the mutations that you inherit from your parents and so on. And I remember when I was wrapping up graduate school, I was mostly focusing on like really applied medical things in transfusion medicine, which for the hematologists and oncologists on here, that stuff's fascinating. But I think to the vast majority of people, it's kind of boring. Yeah. And I remember talking to one of my advisors or committee members, and I was like, I really want to focus the rest of my career on applying these tools for Indigenous people, so we can understand our diaspora, so we can approach these massive gaps in health disparities and really apply the future of medicine. And this person told me, that would be career suicide. Like, stay in your lane, focus on applying these tools to these things. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, brother, like my whole family is here from Hawaii about to watch this dissertation, and you want me to like sweep those ambitions under the rug so I can do normal science?
And what was the career suicide theme that they were?
Yeah.
So what was the implication there? Why would this?
That's a great question. I think it was just that, according to these people who are not from our communities, it's like Indigenous people are notoriously hard to work with. Well, that's because of a history of colonialism and extraction. It's like our communities up to that point were rarely included as actual partners or collaborators, or the expertise of these communities wasn't recognized, right? So from that person's point of view, they had seen science and genomics done in a specific way, and for them, it's risky. But if you're Hawaiian, that's like a natural thing that you would do. That's our kuleana, right? Yeah. So I was like, I'm not shooting myself in the foot. I'm going to, hey, look at me now, bro. But but that really lit a fire under my ass. And I think it allowed me to really prioritize those types of communities. Okay, so I inevitably ended up doing, like you said, a TED Talk on that when I was a graduate student. So you're like completely betting on yourself. Imagine your whole field is really focusing on developing the next generation of therapies for one specific community of people that was at that time Western European ancestry. And then at the same time, clinical trials are going in the same trajectory. And so if you're me, you're just looking at this runaway bias, moving on to the future. And so it's about identifying ways where all of these new tools can be applied. And I never stopped doing that. Okay, so is that the TED Talk you're referring to, or was it the number two?
I like that you did that one too. I also was thinking of a number two. So yeah, if you want to give them both, great.
Sure. Well, I'll get to so they're kind of linked and connected in obvious ways. So then, and that was kind of a more naive version of myself, man. I'm, hardly 30 years old, I don't think yet. And I think I was thinking, yeah, we should apply these new tools to these communities. This is an underserved situation, and there's all this bias, and you're watching the emergence of machine intelligence and machine learning, and we're just biasing every data set and moving in a specific direction. And then I start thinking about where the data is being stored. And I'm like, I don't really think this data, which is extremely valuable, is being stored locally. I think that our communities are still being forced to outsource our genomes to, the La Joillas and the Seattles and the Bostons and these cities where there's major infrastructure built into sequencing facilities and hospitals and, world-class scientists that can do experiments. And then you realize the data is stored somewhere. So where is it stored? And I think that one really important idea is that the data is extremely valuable, and you need to look no further than the 23andMe's of the world and the Ancestry.coms of the world. And these are direct-to-consumer companies that are charging people for access to their genome, and then they're creating relationships with big pharma companies, and they're developing intellectual property. And so this whole series of developments happens. And I'm like, oh, does that mean that the people that we're trying to convince to be involved in these studies, are they in control of their genome in the end of the day? Yeah. If it's stored on the cloud somewhere in Alexandria, Virginia, or London, England. And so that really brings you to the arrival of a new series of ideas. And that is this idea of indigenous data sovereignty, right? The idea that we need to be in full control of that resource, because data, like any other resource, is valuable, like oil or water or diamonds or cobalt or lithium or anything else. And so that arrival, that idea, you start spending time in data centers, and you get to see how harmful they are for the environment. And I remember the whole crypto boom that was going on. People are so excited to make money, via cryptocurrency, but they weren't really thinking about what is the environmental cost of this, of keeping something on the blockchain, of redundancy of data, of storing multiple copies of something. And you arrive at this next horizon where it's you could be in control of your data, but then you're also in control of how harmful processing that information is for the environment and how much heat is emitted. Because I can assure everyone here that there's something called the second law of thermodynamics, and you don't get something for nothing. You can't just create that much information and not have a consequence physically. And that's what's happening with this rapid growth in data center development. And so that brings us to the second TED Talk that just came out, and I encourage people to check it out. And it is the idea that why not utilize and look at the genome as an opportunity to store data? Because what is it but a storage device for your heredity, your history, your lineage, or in Hawaii, as we call our mo'oku'auhau. And if you know that plants photosynthesize and actually create oxygen, which is really good for our atmosphere and combating the climate crisis, then why not store data in plants? And why not maintain biodiversity this way? And why not come up with super risky, paradigm shifting models that are intentionally disruptive to the status quo? And that's what that second one is about.
Yeah, it's just such an out of the box idea of, okay, well, my hard drive is this big. Well, what if my hard drive was the forest?
Yeah.
It's just a amazing sort of flip in perspective that feels very connected to what you started with, which is my driver is rooted in the indigenous peoples. And would that idea have come in the way that your work? I mean, it feels like it's rooted in that or inspired by that in some interesting way. That's one part of the question, is that looking back forward. And the second part is, for you, what is the core value in imagining that future, which, there are many, many steps between here and such a future. What is that value of thinking that far out for shaping how you think about research and activity today?
That is such a good and difficult question. And I think one of the things that we had discussed prior to being on here was, it's like when we dream and we forecast about the future, how far into the future do we go? Are we trying to provide and create solutions that are near futurism, meaning like within our lifetime or within this generation? Or are you willing to think into the future, 10 generations into the future? And that would be like a modality that you see, kind of utilized and philosophically associated with a lot of indigenous communities, right? Like 7 generations, 10 generations into the future. And that's bold, I think, but it's also very important for indigenous people, because that's how we balance the books. That's how we manage resources. And that's from Navajo Nation to Namibia, right? Like you have to really forecast in that way, and we have to train and teach the next generation of people to dream in that way. And then there's the even more gnarly scientific version. Okay, well, what about 100 generations in the future? What are things going to look like? How could you disrupt whole industries? How many civilizations and empires have sprouted up and collapsed and are rubble or ash? And what and where would that take us if we continue to have the same value systems?
Yeah.
And I think, and you could take those trajectories in different directions. Say, okay, is that going to be like 100 generations in a utopian future, in a dystopian future, in an apocalyptic future? So I think that the basic exercises that we do in forecasting and teaching others to forecast, I think that's like a really great place to start.
Yeah. And the other thing that struck me about the early part of your story was the stay in your lane part. And had you stayed in your lane, right, these possible futures wouldn't be on the list, right? The lane is, you can get this grant funded. This is stuff that people already know. This is something that everybody's working on already. And that's how you make a success in science. You stay there. But this pivot sort of says, okay, there's a whole green field over here that no one's looking at.
Yeah.
Right. And and what future? So is that a motivator for how you
Totally. Think about all of the scientists and people you love that we think about romantically, that have like delivered us paradigm shifting changes in civilization. I don't think that they were like, oh, I like this system, let me just sit here in this system. They've always intentionally disrupted and brought that energy and untraditional thought. I have this friend who's from Jamaica who said the only good system is a sound system. And I think if you don't consciously think about disrupting the paradigm that you're in and realize that you are in a box and that it's designed to create innovation that yields only so far, then that's what you'll get, right? But if you if you actually are willing to think big and bold and extend these ideas off into the future and imagine what something would look like, you know, you can go a lot of incredible places. It's not science fiction. It's, that's a reality,
Yeah. And of course, the risk can be that's so ethereal that you can't translate those ideas into any action, anything from the now. So how is it that as you are thinking sort of multiple forecasts away, how does that shape your today? What are we going to work on?
That's a great question too. It's like we're so obsessed with like linear thought processes. We're like all indoctrinated with that. I remember asking a kid, I was teaching a class here at UCSD, and I was like, okay, guys, like here's the Cartesian grid. This is how you understand the world. Right angles everywhere. Manhattan is an island. It was divided up into this Cartesian grid. And I had this kid in the front row. He's a straight A student, but like this kid could not imagine the world in any other geometric or mathematical representation or structure. And I was shocked by that. And I think like it's like basic principles like that we have to let go. You have to let go of that. It's like you look around in the way that architects build the world. It's like it's very clear. Everyone is obsessed with right angles. Try to go through a thought experiment. Think about cities where people don't use right angles and the city planning didn't, result in this way. Maybe that helps you every day think in nonlinear ways. And once you arrive at that position, you can forecast differently too, and you can apply that to different things so that you don't always have to be thinking about profit, exponential growth, key performance indicators. That is a prison for your ideas. That is not what we need right now.
Right. Because it's constrained in such a near future of like these are the deliveries based on what we know, rather than opening ourselves up to what we don't know. Right. And that's what I love about these very challenging out there ideas is that they're like, well, here's something. We'll point that direction. We may never get there, but that's hardly even the point. The point is to sort of give sort of an ideal, an avatar of possibility, and then see where we can go, how we can wander toward that.
Yeah. And even going back in the past, we have this saying in Hawaii, and I'm always thinking about this, and it's such a guiding force for a lot of the science that I think about, but it's ikawamamua kawamahope, and it's walking backwards into the future. And another really good thought experiment for people is, hey, imagine Columbus never makes it to the Bahamas. Cortez and Cook, never make it to their colonial destinations. What is the trajectory of innovation in those civilizations and communities? What do they create? What happens when the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria are still beautiful trees providing oxygen for those ecosystems? Like, what is that reality? What is that if that's our launch pad and our takeoff point for innovation and sustainability? And that origin can bring you to different positions philosophically, but if you're just working with what you got right now, it's pretty constraining.
Yeah, that's great. The other thing that you were talking about earlier, I want to come back to is unpacking a bit of Indigenous data sovereignty. Like what, and of course this is, connects with things that I spend a lot of time thinking about, which is how do we open as much of the research process as possible? And data sovereignty can both alarm and assure people depending on their perspective. So unpack the tensions there of what the interest is and then what people are wrestling with as they're thinking about data sovereignty.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought this up because oftentimes when we mention the word sovereignty and people are coming from a colonial community or colonial perspective, it's like a knee-jerk triggering term because it means that, if these native people want something back, that we've taken away. And oftentimes that is the case, I'll be honest, but I also think that there's this contrast between the way that we represent a lot of science and scientific enterprise.
Yeah.
And so it's often that we're like, hey, we're going to take this willow tree and develop aspirin, and it's for the greater good. Okay. So don't worry about it. Right. It's always the greater good argument. And I think that sometimes, and for a lot of historically marginalized communities, the greater good argument is getting tired, because it's like, whose greater good are we talking about here?
Right. And,
in the case of the African-American community, it's like, you want to talk about the greater good of the Tuskegee experiments. Right. Well, that's not a really good value proposition for that community of people. In fact, that has left this residue of distrust in science and research broadly because of a handful of people's poor decisions, unethical decisions, we should say, too. So I just want to couch what I'm about to say and how we should think about sovereignty and indigenous data sovereignty within that construct. So we know that data has surpassed oil as the number one most valuable resource on planet Earth. It is the reason why there are 3 giant techno-feudalist companies that basically run planet Earth, if we're frank. And because of that, if you're an indigenous community member, you're probably beginning to say, these are our assets. These are our stories. This is my genome. My genome is my community's diasporic lineage over time. That is ours. It's special. I'm not sharing that with you so you can develop the next generation of pharmaceutical drugs like, I don't know, Viagra or whatever it is, without having a fair shake, without sharing the proceeds, without, sharing a piece of the pie. If I gave you the berries and the milk and the, graham crackers, then, I want a piece of that pie. Right. And I think that the basic idea here is just that we have watched colonial relationships and power imbalances pretty much mismanage every single resource up to this point in time. And if you're an indigenous community and you see that happening with this next resource, you're asking yourself, how do I get into pole position to vertically control that? So I tell you what the terms are, whether it's, mismanagement of sandalwood in Hawaii and how we have nothing to show for it, right? Or cobalt in the copper belt in Democratic Republic of Congo, or, specific critical earth minerals like lithium in Bolivia. And so I think that the parallels in that sense should make a lot of sense now. Is that helpful?
Yeah. And I'm wondering, does the concept stay the same in the context of commercialization use of data and research use of data? Would you make any differentiation there? Or would you say same issues?
Yeah. And that is like the most important distinction, because we all, I think, believe that when we discover something and it has direct applicable value for something like human health or the health of the ocean or our atmosphere, like, we should extend those ideas and accomplishments and those truths really to everyone. Right. In the sense of research. Right. I think that's really important. But I think the problem is that capitalism has become this operating system that's just run rampant over and supersedes, a lot of what research has become today. It's like people don't want, it's like scientists need funding to do work, to make new data. And if that money comes from, systems and investors and even federal governments, there are strings that are often attached. And so that warps the reality of it. And that's unfortunate, because I think that the idea of sharing information is really important for a lot of the things that your organization works on. Reproducibility. We have one-off science that becomes a truth when nobody reproduced the experiments and shared their results and no one compared notes. That's extremely dangerous. That's extremely dangerous. We have journals and publishing houses running rampant, meaning like the prestige of an idea that comes out in a marquee journal with a high impact factor, somehow that idea is more valuable than something that's published as a preprint and freely shared and freely accessible to universities and people around the world, where they don't have to worry about paying publishing agreements like the University of California or Harvard or University of Virginia or whatever. And I think that is a really, really dangerous position that we find ourselves in as seekers of knowledge and truth today in 2024.
The theme I hear in your comments is that for science to actually be a public good, it has to be public. And that's at the end stage, right? Is right now commercial systems that dominate control access to the research findings, and that creates barriers, especially to people with less resources, to access those findings, to make use of those findings. Then the other parts of your comments were, I think, suggesting that it's really the entire life cycle of the research, that because of the potential for commercialization of one's genome, regardless of the researcher's intent, or at least initial intent, all of the other parts of that system that are in play, if they're not involved in the process at the outset of engaging in what's the research for, how is my data going to be used, then it's not actually serving as a public good.
I could not agree with you more. And I think one thing we're observing is this runaway effect with that now that's happening with the emergence of, deep learning, just awarded a Nobel Prize.
Right.
And we're watching that gap in who has access to cutting edge tools to process that much data and information. And it's really a handful of groups. It's so dangerous because there are so many new levels of bias that are going to be introduced into these inevitabilities. Like, man, who has access to that much computational horsepower? Is it the communities that need those materials? What types of partnerships are going to evolve in the future? And it's hard not to see a brave new world of health disparities emerging. I mean, we need to get the best minds in the world to produce solutions in that space, because the direction it's going is pretty dystopian.
Yeah. And is it the case that you think that the solutions don't yet exist, or they do exist, or at least have been conceived and just haven't yet been implemented?
Oof, that is the question. I think that there are a number of solutions. I'm a huge proponent of decentralization. Okay. You probably could have guessed that. Yeah. But I think that means that we're just democratizing access to technology. We're creating technological independence. We're allowing more people to develop tools and methods and scripting, languages and things like this based on these tools. But when only a handful of people have access to them, that becomes really, really difficult. And then on the backside of that, it's expertise. So if we're not training the next generation of people to have a level of fluency and literacy in using these tools, then we can expect to get more of the same. And that's also dangerous. And I want people to think about this. It's like, of the we're speaking English right now to communicate these ideas. On the back end of a lot of the computational tools that you use, there are a handful of scripting languages that have been developed to create neural nets, to create large language models, to parse data in these ways. And how many of those languages have been developed by Indigenous people? How many of them exist as a form or a medium to communicate digitally the philosophies and ideas that we're expressing? And the answer is very few of them. I mean, R was developed by Ras Ihaka. That's a Maori man. But the vast majority of these languages and the mediums in which we communicate digitally are, designed for a means to an end. It doesn't mean that you can't mathematically represent things in a number of different ways. But I want people to think about like the embedded level of bias that exists. Like, when we pop the hood and we look inside, what are we talking about here too? And so there are so many different levels to the ways that we can create solutions, but we have to privilege those perspectives more.
Yeah. So in part, it's making the actual process itself inclusive. Like solutioning requires everybody that is impacted to be part of the solutioning. It sounds like a key theme. The other part I'm hearing is like the communication protocols. Yes, there need to be standards, but they're ones where it distributes the control rather than centralizes the control. So standards for how we communicate, but give everybody the empowerment both on what they contribute and what they extract from that.
Yes. And that's totally right. I have a good friend of mine, David Lang, and he is obsessed with technology shocks. And if you don't know what this is, it's a pretty cool concept. And it's like, where does hip hop come from? I love hip hop. I love music. And there was a blackout in Queens or Brooklyn or somewhere in New York City. And because of that blackout, a bunch of turntables, I don't want to say legally or illegally, ended up in the hands of people that wouldn't normally have access to turntables. And so these community members were just hooking them up in like places like Washington Square Park and, random places that have access to electricity through lampposts in, Brooklyn and the Bronx. And they started coming up with new types of music using these tools. And that is like a total paradigm shift. And it's a technology shock.
Yeah.
And it resulted in all of these untold forms of innovation. It's like if you don't enable that in an honest way, then you can expect the normal path of innovation. You can't expect revolutions without, democratizing access to that technology. Are you kidding me? Right. And so part of like what I'm really interested in is in computer science and in genomics, how do we enable more technology shocks and bring these tools into the hands of Indigenous people in Indigenous spaces and allow them to innovate and identify problems that only they could identify and create solutions that only they could. And that is the good trouble I want to bring to the world.
Right. Excellent. Well, good trouble is a great way to start to close this conversation as we're hitting our time. Are there any points that you want to make sure we hit before we close for today?
No way. I just wanted to say it's like amazing getting to talk to you about this stuff. And I have tremendous respect for your work and your organization. And also just a huge thank you to RWJF for everything that they're doing and the way that they're approaching this and putting on such a clever series of talks over the next few days. Yeah. And I'd like to hear what the audience has to say, what kind of questions they have for us.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and thank you. It's just a wonderful conversation. I just admire the perspective that you bring to these problems and the willingness to reach so far beyond where we are to sort of point lights at where we could be. So it's just really great work. For everyone that has joined, please, if you have any ideas for a shirt based on things that you heard in the conversation today, please drop them in the chat. You will receive a recap later in the day or tomorrow, and information for tomorrow about how to join and how to get the free t-shirt. And just thank you again for joining us, and thank you to RWJF for making it possible. This closes out my role in this week. And now I hand the baton to Keolu, who is going to take on the host role for tomorrow. So maybe I will pass it to you to give a preview of what to expect for tomorrow. And then you can close us out.
Yeah, happy to, everybody. I think that you guys know that we're doing this unscripted kind of passage of different types of conversations where we're kind of threading the needle on ideas that are kind of peripherally related, but very, very different. And the through line really is the future of science and innovation. So I will be speaking to Sarah tomorrow from Harvard University, and our conversation is going to focus on a lot of the parallels and types of bias that exist in gender in science. And so I'll do my best to think about different examples and be a gracious moderator, just like Brian has been.
Fantastic. Great. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. Be well.
Yep. Thanks, guys. Aloha. Hui hou.